Hello everyone, I'm Matt Latham, the KronoGraph Product Manager, and today we're going to be taking a look at the latest release from Cambridge Intelligence focusing on timeline visualization. But first, let me give you a brief introduction into who I am. I've been with Cambridge Intelligence for just under a year now. Prior to joining Cambridge Intelligence, I spent many years building products in the network analytics space. I worked with a variety of customers from SMBs to large enterprise to help them make sense of complex IT networks. I have a passion for great visualization, and I think the goal of any intelligence product is to generate insights from seemingly unconnected data. So let's have a look at the agenda for today. First, I'll introduce you to KronoGraph. What is it? Why do you need it? How do you use it? We'll take a look at 3 demos, which will introduce you to some basic concepts. Next, we'll refresh our minds on some of the challenges of time-based data, what they do well, what they don't. Then comes a couple of data visualization challenges. In challenge 1, drawing from my own experience in IT analytics, we'll look at visualization techniques for identifying the cause of a network traffic problem. In challenge 2, we'll look at a larger data set with the intention of finding patterns. And then we'll spend a little time exploring ways to enrich timelines with annotations. And then finally, we'll wrap up. So let's get started. What is KronoGraph? So KronoGraph is a timeline visualization software development kit, an SDK for JavaScript and React developers. Developers use the KronoGraph SDK to quickly and easily build powerful timeline applications, roll them into their investigative tools and workflows, and deploy them anywhere. KronoGraph is unique. There is no other application quite like it on the market. It's the first developer toolkit for building browser-based interactive timeline visualizations. We work with customers across many different verticals, from cyber and IT, security and intelligence, law enforcement, pharma, supply chain, and so on. Whereas most time-based visualizations are good at providing insights for one or a limited number of entities, KronoGraph is able to provide insights for thousands of entities all in one timeline. So there's no better way to properly understand KronoGraph until we actually see it. So let's take a look at some demos, starting with an insider trading demo. So here we can see a data set of trades, both individual and institutional investors buying and selling stocks. We've also included communications here. These are telephone calls. And on the left-hand side, we can see entities. We've grouped these into stocks, individuals, and institutional investors. On the right-hand side, we see events currently shown in heat map view to summarize a much larger underlying data set. An important point here is that we're showing you the entire data set all in one view. This allows us to spot patterns within the overall context of the data. So the heat map is used to summarize underlying events. The brighter the cell, the more events, or the greater the transaction value, you get to choose. Different coloured cells will show different types of activity. In our legend on the right, we can see anything green is an investor buying stock, anything red is an investor selling stock, and anything blue is a communication between individuals, in this case telephone calls. Once the lens is open, I can scroll entities through the lens to see more detail. Closing the lens will return me to the big picture of the data. As I zoom into the timeline, we'll start to see individual events. You'll notice the events are coloured like the heat map, because the heat map's summarising the events. Each event can connect entities, so we may see entities buying and selling megacorp stock, the red and green, or we may see entities communicating to each other, the blue. The arrows show the direction of each event. Along the top, we have our time scale, showing at which point in time the event occurred. And we can also hover over these events for more information. So let's reset our view and take a look at these 2 lines overlaid on top of the heat map. We call these markers. We have one called profit warning and another called record profits announced. KronoGraph allows you to add these markers anywhere in your timeline, and they're a good way to correlate events with significant external events that may form part of your investigation. In this case, we're interested in unusual activity around the time Megacorp publicly announced a profit warning and record profits. So by drawing a marquee over the timeline, I can zoom a little bit more into the data. Now I'm looking at activity just before the profit warning was announced. I can clearly see there is some activity. It appears Shaney Keebler is selling Megacorp stock just before the announcement, so it might be a coincidence. Let's focus on Shaney. This allows us to filter out everything from the timeline except Shaney's activity. We can see that Shaney sold 4 lots of Megacorp stock. We can also see Shaney was active just before record profits were announced, this time buying Megacorp stock. A definite pattern is emerging, and again we can zoom back out here and we can use the marquee tool to go into that into more detail if we want to. So how did Shaney time his trade so well? Is he incredibly lucky or psychic, or was he getting insider knowledge? So let's zoom to fit again, and this time we're going to turn on communications. Now we see events in blue for everyone Shaney communicated with. Again, let's zoom into the profit warning. And we can see that Austin Little called Shaney just before the trades. It's interesting, but definitely no pattern there yet. It could just be a very innocuous telephone call. Let's zoom to fit again and let's have another look at the other big event. And again, we can see a communication between Austin Little and Shaney Keebler just before he started buying Megacorp stock, right before the announcement. It's probably a suspicious activity and falling into the pattern of insider trading, and it's very, very easy to get this information within KronoGraph. So we've introduced some basic KronoGraph concepts. We now know how KronoGraph represents entities, events, and summarizes big data into a heat map with drill downs into individual events. So let's look at the next demo, which is a credit card fraud demo. In this demo, we're looking at disputed transactions from cardholders. We've used our groups a little differently this time. We have a group for entities who have no disputes, and a group for those who have disputes, and a group of merchants. We've added red glyphs next to each entity with a dispute and coloured their events red, and they allow you to call out important information such as flagged transactions, disputes, or alerts. Let's focus on Mark. And remember, when we focus on Mark, it filters out everything else in the timeline except Mark's activity. So hovering over this transaction here, we can see that Mark had a disputed transaction to the Apple Store of just under $2,000. If I double click on this, it will add a marker to the chronograph timeline, and now we can actually see this in the context of the overall data. Using the marquee tool, I can zoom into this area again and actually see there were 4 other entities, Paul, Olivia and Madison, who all had transactions to the Apple Store that were disputed around the same time period. We can also go a step further and start to size transactions by amount to be able to see those larger transactions on the timeline easily. So in this demo, while simple, we've shown that there are creative ways you can group information and call out important events using glyphs. So on to the next demo, we're going to look at crime investigation. This demo shows the combination of KronoGraph and our graph visualization products, Keylines and Regraph. We have the graph in map mode. It's using Esri mapping tiles and shows a crime spree in both the timeline and the geospatial format. Many events are actually just observations. So an observation could be a witness testimony, a number plate recognition camera, a cell phone tower logging a connection to a cell phone, etc. Each observation gives you a connection between an entity, a location, and a time. We can show these observations as chains on a map, where each observation for a particular entity is linked to the next. This is the blue route you're seeing, showing the suspect's path from New Jersey to Manhattan. Or we can show observations in a timeline using KronoGraph. The crimes themselves are shown as red markers on the map and white marker lines, which we saw in the previous demo, on the timeline. If we zoom into the timeline, the map is updated to reflect where the suspect was between that time period. And if I zoom out again and uncheck the camera recognition, you'll also see that the map will adapt and update to reflect the new route based upon the evidence that we're actually giving it. Let's turn on ALPR again, and now we'll add some events to the demo that are non-geospatial observations. So I'm going to tick the calls box, and this is just adding a bunch of phone calls made by the suspect during this time period. And these show up on the timeline, but they can't be shown on the map, which is why it's really useful to have a map and a timeline viewed together. If we have a look at the robbery event in a little bit more detail and zoom into this 7-Eleven, we can actually see a series of phone calls made to a 555 number. So suddenly we have another dimension to our investigation. We possibly have another suspect that we can start investigating. Now let's look at some of the challenges of time-based data. And here we see some common ways for visualizing time-based data. It's fair to say that most time-based visualizations are good at either detailed views of events or high-level summaries, but not both. So here we see a traditional way of visualizing network traffic. We have a time series chart for a single device showing traffic fluctuations over time. Typically, we'd have a threshold line, and we'd raise an alert when traffic levels go above that threshold. Once we have an alert, we then need to find out what caused the issue. And there could be any number of things. It could be a backup running on the network, taking up a lot of bandwidth. It could be an attack from outside the network, or a bad software configuration pushed to the device. This last one is responsible for many network traffic issues. Usually network admins will push software out to devices periodically. So can we visualize these activities in a time series chart? This is another common technique. We've overlaid an event on the time series. This allows us to correlate a configuration change on that device with the sudden rise of network traffic. It's effective, but what if there were many configuration changes done by many network admins? You would have to overlay a lot of events, and this chart would get unreadable very quickly. So how does KronoGraph visualize this? At the top, we have our device time series showing the spike in traffic, same time series as the slides before. We have a group on the KronoGraph timeline called network devices, where rather than just show one device, we're showing all devices that have received a config update within the time window. We have another group called network admins, and we can see we have quite a few, all pushing updates within a very short period of time. But we can clearly see Michael pushed an update out to 2 devices, both are showing as red, down, or problematic, and the update does correlate with a spike in network traffic. So with KronoGraph, investigating issues like this are made easier, allowing you to get to root cause sooner. We actually have a demo of this that we can show a very similar concept. In this demo, we've coupled KronoGraph with our GraphViz product. KronoGraph is on the left, and we see 2 time series at the top, CPU and memory. Both of these metrics belong to Dan's MacBook Air. We have a blue group called Internet, and these are all the pages and resources that Dan's MacBook has accessed. Essentially, he's surfing the web. In the green group, called Local, these are all the network devices that Dan's MacBook is connected to on the local network. And then on the right, we have a graph representation of the same thing, of those relationships between those different entities. If I zoom into the timeline, I reveal more detail on the events in KronoGraph, and you'll also notice that the graph adapts to show only the devices and the internet pages active within the time window. So let's reset this view and look at these 2 spikes. We've got a spike on the CPU and a spike on the memory. very similar to our traffic utilization problem. If I wanted to see the particular events responsible for those spikes, I could use the marquee tool to zoom over that period of the timeline. I could even go into more granular detail right here. And then we can see all of the different events that were occurring at the time when these metrics started to peak. So it's a great way for being able to correlate various different events with performance metrics of interest. And it's particularly effective if you're able to pair that with one of the graph visualization tools to get that adaptive layout while you're doing it. So on to challenge 2. In this challenge, we're going to analyze approximately 40,000 events between 1968 and 2009 from the RAND database of worldwide terrorism incidents. It's a database that documents every terror act in every country and what happened. The data is provided in the CSV table format that we can see here. And we want to answer the following questions. To answer the first questions, we could filter the table to show only African countries, then count events for each year from 1968 to 2009, but this is not efficient at all. We would also be able to only see a tiny fraction of the data set at any time, as tables usually show 50 rows at most before a user needs to page. We could also try plotting entities in a standard time series chart, but as we've seen and talked about, very soon, after only a very few entities, our chart would be a mess. What if we wanted to ask the follow-up question? What other countries has this terror group operated in? Then we'd have to remove all of our table filters and apply new ones. Another problem is that when we start filtering out data in the table, we lose sight of that bigger picture. Now let's look at chronograph, visualizing the same data set. Chronograph is showing all 40,000 events summarized in one view here. Let's look at our groups again. We have a group for each continent and a group for the terror organizations. Along the top, we can see our timescales ranges from about 1968 to 2009. And the heat map is representing terror activity around the world. Let's answer the same questions I posed earlier. What African country saw a notable increase in terror events in 1994? So we used our marquee tool a few times so far. Let's drag over 1994, and we have most of 1994 in view here. And let's have a look at Africa in more detail. I can already see it looks like Algeria is definitely the culprit here. And if we zoom in a little bit more, we can start to see those individual events. But I'm pretty confident that Algeria is the country that has the notable increase in terror activity. I'm going to focus on Algeria now. Remember, what this does is it filters the timeline to remove all activity except Algeria's. And I can very clearly see that the armed Islamic group is predominantly responsible for these attacks. And then if we're going to ask our final question, what other countries has this terror group operated in? It would be as simple as refocusing the timeline onto the armed Islamic group and then zooming out to see all of the countries within the timeline. And I can see that they've also operated in France and Tunisia. So in a matter of a few clicks and interactions, I'm able to answer some very probing questions quickly. Finally, let's talk about enriching timelines with annotations. Sometimes there are multiple events that interest us as part of an investigation, and this is where traditional approaches fail because you can usually only display information for one event at a time. So how do we enrich our timelines for multiple events? Here we see a timeline showing social media activity for various entities. We have a YouTube feed, a Facebook feed, Twitter, WhatsApp. The events we see are interactions between different users of those platforms. So if we click on Bob's Facebook event here, we can see an info panel showing that he shared a story from XYZ News on his Facebook feed. Clicking the next event, it shows him sharing a YouTube video from XYZ onto his Facebook feed. If we look at the Twitter timeline down here, we can see that Bob has liked a tweet from Sarah who's apparently bought some donuts. So you notice that some events in the timeline all have these info panels that we can actually click on and get more information. But you'll also notice these little speech bubbles. And if I start turning these speech bubbles on, we have another way to display information. But this time I'm actually displaying information from multiple events of interest at the same time. And the annotations are responsive to the timeline. So if I zoom in and then start panning across the timeline, these annotations will come in, and as I pan them out, they'll disappear. That draws us to a close for this webinar. I'd like to remind you once again that KronoGraph is just one of a suite of visualization tools that we provide to developers. You've seen keylines and regraph in action at various different times throughout the demos, but if you're interested, we've got a lot more to show you. And I couldn't finish this webinar without showing a slide of some of the amazing customers who have helped our products become the market leaders they are today. We really hope you'll join us on that journey. And if you'd like any information on how KronoGraph or our GraphViz products can either integrate with each other, or you'd like to take them into some form of evaluation or POC, you can contact me directly or KronoGraph support. And I thank you very much for your time today.